Hello, this is State Senator Pamela Altoff, and as many of you can recall, we have been discussing school funding reform all throughout this 100th General Assembly session. The last communication I've had with all of you was Senator Dan McConkey explaining to you what happened at the task force and some of the legislation that was proceeding. Today I have with me Senator Jason Barackman, who has actually filed phenomenal legislation that I think will do exactly what we've been talking about in bringing school funding reform in balance and providing monies for every single child, regardless of where they are located geographically. I would like him to tell you today what his bill does and how it differs from the Senate bill that passed just yesterday and is more of a Senate Democrat idea of legislation. So without further ado, Senator Barackman, can you for me enumerate the differences between Senate Bill 1, which was sponsored by Andy Minar of Springfield, and your legislation, which is something that the Senate Republicans have been working on all throughout session, and why it is we feel that your approach is significantly better and more responsible than obviously Senator Minar's.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. You know, this is interesting. This conversation has really seen a lot of progress over the several years that many of us, both sides of the aisle, have worked on it. Here's what's good about where we're at. Over the last few years, the result of all of these discussions that continue even now today is that there is a coalescing around what's called an evidence-based funding model. Mm-hmm. And that's significant. That is a significant shift in thinking from the way that we fund our schools today. The notion that we would embrace data and best practices and let those guide funding decisions on schools is a really significant step. And it's one that I'm very proud of, and I'm glad to see that in all the forms of legislation that are out there, there's this embracing of the evidence-based model.
And Senator McConkey did address those evidence
Good.
and the 27 components
Good.
that would be considered. So thank you.
So as a baseline here, now that you have both Republicans and now Democrats joining this evidence-based model, you have to look at the next level of, so what's the difference of one piece of legislation, you referenced Senate Bill 1, that does embrace the evidence-based model, and something like mine, Senate Bill 1124, that also embraces that. There's a couple key differences. Number one is the manner in which we address the very controversial Chicago Block Grant. The Chicago Block Grant is a set-aside that allocates roughly $250 million to the Chicago public school system above and beyond the dollars that they would otherwise be eligible for if they were treated like every other school district in the state. So how that Chicago Block Grant is handled is kind of a key difference. The Senate Democrat version embraces that, continues it. The Republican version says that's bad policy and that's an ineffective use of dollars that's not tied to actual students, so we do away with it. There's other things. Senate Bill 1, the Democrat version, picks up the Chicago public school pension obligations.
Right.
Another key difference here. Now the Senate Democrats have long said that they want parity within the educational system, and they point to the fact that the state of Illinois pays for pensions for all of our school districts except for Chicago. That's true. But when you have the Chicago Block Grant, presumably offsetting that amount, creates a mixed message for the Democrats. The other component is that there are other areas where parity is lacking within the educational system, and the Democrats have refused to talk about those areas. Those are things like mandate relief, giving flexibility to school districts to control their costs, make personnel decisions, classroom decisions. Today, the Chicago public school system has more flexibility by law than any other school district in the state. And so what we've said is if we're going to have parity, what we'd like to do is make sure that parity extends to all of those things that affect our school districts, not just this decision on pensions. You had a question?
No, I was going to say, and my understanding is at one time is the state of Illinois did in fact, pay for Chicago pensions. And it was a request by Chicago to take that back so that they would have more regulatory authority over their own pension system. And now it didn't work out the way they thought, so they would like the state to come back in and
yeah, you're very kind. They asked for more flexibility over their pension system, and what we've seen since the time that they took control of their pensions is that they made a number of bad financial decisions.
Correct.
Things similar to what the state of Illinois has done with their pension system. Chicago skipped payments, borrowed payments, and has created an unfunded liability within their pension system that has now resulted in balloon payments for which they don't have the money to pay, and they're looking to Springfield to help. And I think as Republicans, we've tried to be reasonable here and say, look, we want a system that's fair, reasonable, has parity for all of our kids, no matter Chicago, suburban, downstate. But what we can't do is put forward legislation that simply bails out Chicago. I think a bailout is something that's not going to be acceptable to taxpayers throughout the state who are looking at incredible financial problems throughout our state and problems within our educational system that don't just exist in Chicago. We've got, if you follow the data, to go back to these models, if you follow the data and the evidence, what you see is that there are hundreds of school districts in our state who are in a financially worse position than Chicago, yet they don't get the attention. Obviously, there's a size difference here, but they don't get the attention that Chicago does. And I think it's our job as legislators from around the state to make sure that those families and those students who go to those schools who are in worse shape than Chicago also have a seat at this table when we negotiate a true and fair funding formula.
So let me ask an obvious question that we've discussed in my district forever. Chicago, the last time they had a school referendum was?
Boy,
1960s. And I can tell you...
I wasn't quite in this world at that time.
Thank you very much for pointing that out again. But the point is, I'm going to guess your district, which is in the Bloomington area, many of your school districts have probably proposed referendums to ensure quality education for all of their children. We have done that in District 32 in almost every single school district. And again, I find it vastly unfair that we are willing to take and tax ourselves more, and yet we're not receiving the same support and adequate funding from the state of Illinois because it's being diverted to the city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I concur entirely. Certainly, in Central Illinois, I represent probably some 35 school districts, and they're all, some very rural districts, some more urban, Bloomington-Normal area. Many of those districts have made very tough choices at a local level, and they've made those choices because they believe in the high-quality school system that they want their kids to be a part of. Those same people are also paying income taxes to our state, and yes, asking them to pay more money to divert money through Springfield and ultimately to Chicago because Chicago's not making the decisions that the rest of us are making, I think creates an unfair situation.
I would agree. Anything else that you think that is important in the legislation, your legislation that we are all supporting, that my constituents should be aware of, particularly my educators, my school superintendents, my school board members, that makes a substantial difference between what passed in the Senate and what it is that we would like to see?
Yeah, I think there's one other kind of big chunk here, which is the notion of mandate relief. Mandate relief has been a big kind of talking point around the Capitol for many years. But what you see year after year is even though lawmakers talk about asking school districts to do less, what they do is year after year pass more and more mandates. So what I've proposed is that we give some very significant mandate relief to school districts, allowing them to opt out, things like PE, driver's ed, to utilize third parties for certain contracting decisions, opting out of a whole set of unfunded mandates.
Unfunded, the key word.
Yeah.
We require you to do this, but we're not going to provide
Exactly.
you any funds in which to initiate those programs.
So there are a lot of school districts around the state who aren't necessarily going to benefit from a changed school funding formula because there's a high level of resources available locally in a number of districts. So especially in those districts that are experiencing high property taxes, what we want to do is give relief. I've got many of those too, but yes, I hear you. We want to give relief to those districts in the form of unfunded mandate relief so that locally people can make decisions about the services they're going to offer to their children. These are things outside the classroom that aren't jeopardizing health, life, and safety.
Right.
Give some flexibility to school districts to choose how and what they're going to fulfill, with the notion that it's going to better reflect local choices and hopefully give a chance for school boards to say we can do more with less money and maybe give a chance to see some relief on property taxes.
I appreciate that. If you would like to see additional information, you can go to the Illinois General Assembly website. You can look up Senate Bill
1124 and 1125.
And they are tied together. If you have additional questions or you'd like more information, you can call my office, which is 815-455-6330, or you can visit the website and send me a message via the website and ask any questions that you would like with regard to our proposal. So thank you very much for listening to Senator Barackman and having him explain really the amount of work that has been given toward this effort and really what we think is the appropriate decision, particularly for District 32 constituents.